What is up, guys? Dzeeff here, and this past weekend there was a Yu-Gi-Oh! Extravaganza event. Those are always fun. I've played in a few of them so far, and I played in this one for a few rounds. I wasn't doing as well as I wanted to be doing, so I dropped out and entered the attack of the Giant Card side event, which I had a lot of fun in a few weeks ago, where I won that Giant Arcana Triumph Joker. So I thought maybe I would give it another shot. This time around, the Giant Card up for grabs was the Shooting Majestic Star Dragon, the brand new cover card from Dawn of Majesty, so I really wanted to try and win that. I will say that the event did not go as smoothly as the previous Giant Card. It felt like every single round I was fighting for my life out there, and also I got pretty unlucky because one of the things that happens with these Giant Card events when they're ran as remote duels is that very often they actually get to more than 32 players but less than 64 players, so they have to do like a bonus round at the beginning to get it down to 32 players because it is a single elimination event, and I had to play that extra round, which was pretty frustrating. But regardless, I managed to make my way to top 4, and unfortunately I lost in top 4, but in the Giant Card side events at that point it actually goes to a 3rd, 4th playoff, which is pretty cool. 3rd place gets an oversized card, which I believe is like half the size of a Giant Card, and I did manage to win that playoff. This event was pretty fun. It actually was one of the harder events I've played in. I played against meta almost every single round against some really good opponents. Anyway, I played Altergeist. I did make some pretty significant changes to this deck in my opinion. Dawn of Majesty didn't really bring that many new competitive cards to the game, but there were some metagame shifts that I wanted to address with this deck, so hopefully you guys can enjoy those in today's video, especially if you're trying to play Altergeist in the current format. I will say that this deck I think is worse off now than it has been over the past like couple of weeks here, maybe even couple of months. Drytron is this deck's worst matchup, especially when you go second, and Drytron is really gaining popularity, so I don't know how good this deck will be in the coming weeks, but it is pretty good against most of the other decks. Tri-Brigade, Virtual World, Prank Kid, Sky Strikers, those are all pretty good matchups for Altergeist going 1st or 2nd. It's just a Drytron where you really struggle a lot, especially when you lose the die roll. Anyway, we had 3 copies of Marionetter, 3 copies of Multi-Faker, 3 copies of Meliseek, 2 copies of Silk, which I always drew, and 1 copy of Concrete. It's the standard Altergeist lineup that you guys are familiar with. You've seen it time and time again. There's no real reason to make any changes to it. I think that is the perfect ratio for all of those cards. For the hand traps, we played 3 copies of Ash Blossom. It's still like the best generic hand trap in pretty much any matchup. Some hand traps might be more impactful in particular matchups, but Ash is at least usable in every matchup, which is pretty good in a format as diverse as the one we're currently in. I also swapped out the Bells, and I'm now playing Valor for a pretty similar reason. I think that Valor has gotten better over the past few weeks because it's a card that is generically good in pretty much every single matchup. It's particularly strong against Tri-Brigade, of course. Oftentimes, the one effect Valor can completely shut off your opponent's entire turn, which is pretty good. So I like Valor a lot. I actually didn't play Bell in the main or side deck, which was hard because up until this point, I have liked Bell quite a bit, but I just didn't have the space for it, so I cut it completely. But Valor was a pretty good substitute, and what's cool about Valor in particular is that when you draw multiple copies, you can actually use all of the copies in the same turn, unlike a card like Ash or Bell, so I like that a lot. That was it for the monsters, though. Moving on to the spells, there's only 3 of them, you probably already know, but we have 3 copies of Pot of Extravagance. I really don't think Prosperity is good in this deck at all. I know some people like it to dig for specific cards, but when I play this deck, I just want card advantage. I want to trade my opponent down to a simplified game state so that I can combo off and make a big board, and I think that Extravagance is like the best way to help achieve that goal. Prosperity isn't wrong necessarily. The card is still very good, and it does give you some more flexibility in the extra deck, but I love Extravagance. It's so powerful. It did get ashed almost every single time in the Giant Card event, though, which was pretty sad, but when it doesn't get ashed, it's like a huge instant win right there. It's really great. Then we have 3 copies of Spoofing, of course, 2 copies of Protocol, and 1 copy of Manifestation. Once again here, those are the standard Altergeist lineups. I've messed around with other ratios in the past, but I think it's perfectly fine for right now. We also have 3 copies of Solemn Strike and 3 copies of Judgment. I know more and more people are cutting Judgment from the main deck, but my side deck space was super tight, and I think that Judgment is such an auto win in game 1 when you go first that I really like including it in the main deck, even though it is pretty dead when you go second. I will say though that because this particular format is pretty back and forth, sometimes you actually can use the Judgment when you go second if it's a more grindy matchup. We have 3 copies of Infinite Impermanence. Obviously that's a staple in a lot of decks right now, but especially Altergeist. I did not open Faker and Impermanence once in the main event or in the Giant card though, which was pretty sad. One of the new cards I was playing in this event, well, new, old card, whatever, but I played 3 copies of Rivalry of Warlords in my main deck. I like this card a lot right now. You can lock your opponents out of the game pretty easily with this card, no matter what deck they're playing for the most part. Even against like Drytron, if they make a Link Kribo, you can Rivalry and pretty much stop their entire turn. Against Tri-Brigades, while a lot of the best ones are Beast monsters, they do have a number of cards that are not Beast monsters, and Rivalry is very good against Revolt as well. I wish I drew this card a lot more. In testing it was very good, but in the tournament I only drew it twice, and one of those times the rest of my hand was so good it didn't actually matter. But I think Rivalry is a very strong main deck choice right now. The last card is Imperial Order. It's a card where if you draw it you probably win. I like that card a lot. For the extra deck, we have 3 copies of Hextia, 1 copy of Prime Banshee, 3 copies of Link Kribo, 1 Almirage, 1 Anima, 1 Moon Maiden. I think I actually am going to increase the number of Moon Maiden in the deck. Yeah, the arrow is complete garbage, but there was a game that I maybe should have lost. I did banish the Moon Maiden off Extravagance, and I had the Secret Village. I decided to go for All Mirage anyway, and then my opponent had Twin Twisters and a Cosmic Cyclone. Maybe I shouldn't have tried to add Multi-Faker to my hand, who knows. But if I would have had the Moon Maiden, it would have been a lot easier. That's probably more of a misplay on my part, but I think going forward, Moon Maiden might be a good choice to play at 2 copies. I also played Nightmare Unicorn, I guess. I mean, this card was pretty bad, but it is what it is. 1 copy of this thing that outs Dragoon sometimes, 1 copy of Selene, 1 copy of Avermax, and I borrowed 1 copy of Access Code from my friend Austin. I think these cards are kind of all flex spots. I think that the Selene and the Access Code Talker are guaranteed. I decided to not play Helki Firebrax. I found myself not using that card that often. You can just make this Selene in the deck because you play Spellcaster monsters, but I will say there was one match where it did come up that I didn't have the Helki Firebrax. I like Nibiru'd my opponent, and then I drew a hand trap for turn with no Altergeist cards, and it would have been nice to go into Helk and then Selene and then Access Code. That would have been pretty strong, but it is what it is. I think Helk is a good choice, but I wanted some flex spots here. I think Unicorn is probably the weakest link. Avermax and the World Chalice guy do have their uses. This one outs Dragoon. This one can do a lot of damage, and it's pretty hard for a striker to out sometimes, but Unicorn was pretty bad, so that could be the Helk. It could be a Phoenix, might not be bad. There are a number of cards you can play. Honestly, though, I never went into any of these Link 3 or higher monsters. This deck doesn't really do that as often as you might think, but yeah, it's pretty hard because the Multi-Faker does restrict you to Altergeist monsters when you use the special summon from deck effect. So that means if you have a lot of monsters on the board, usually you used a Multi-Faker effect, which means you can't summon those bigger Link monsters. For the side deck, we have 3 copies of Nibiru, 3 copies of Skullmeister. This was a really hard decision on my end. I know Skullmeister is very good right now, and it was a very good card in the tournament, but it could have been Bell, it could have been Cycle Reader. It was Cycle Reader up until like the last 2 seconds before I submitted my deck list, honestly, but I think Skullmeister is a very good card. It's obviously very good against a lot of matchups, prank kids especially if you just have a Meister. A lot of times they pass turn, but I feel like in hindsight I would have played Cycle Reader. I played against so many Drytron players, and it is this deck's worst matchup. So while Skullmeister might be better against a variety of decks, I think because of how bad of a matchup this deck has against a Drytron, you really want a card like Cycle Reader in your deck, so I'm probably going to play that card going forward. I also chickened out this event, and I think this was probably the only mistake throughout the main extra and side besides the not playing Helki Firebrax thing. I played 1 Gamma Seal and 1 Kumongous. They're fine. Like, they out Dragoon, they out cards that this deck normally can't deal with, like the Arrival Ad Ignister, which I did play against, but these cards are just just so awkward sometimes. If you draw like enough hand traps to stop your opponent's combo and then you have the kaiju, it means that these cards basically do nothing. That actually happened multiple times. I mean, when you side deck in games 2 and 3 and you're going second, you have so many hand traps. There's 9 in the main deck, you have Skullmeisters, you have Nibiru's in some matchups. That is a lot of hand traps, and if you draw like any 2 of those, the kaijus aren't going to matter because your opponent's not going to put up a board. I did like the kaijus because, yeah, as people keep bringing up, this deck does have a very difficult time against Dragoon. It's pretty much an auto loss, but I think it's not worth it to play cards like these, and I actually much rather would have had these be a pointer of the Red Lotus. I did cut that card from the side deck. I mentioned it wasn't very good in my last profile, but I really missed that card in this event. I mean, I got lightning stormed, I got dustered, so many different games. I would have loved to had a card like that when I was going first, but these cards were like okay, but honestly a lot of the time they were completely unnecessary. Yeah, if your opponent like summons Dragoon, you probably lose those games, but if you have like a Veiler or an Impermanence, you can just stop the Anaconda. If they hard draw the fusion, they hard draw the fusion, I guess, but I don't think I'd play these cards going forward. I've played them in this deck in the past, like pretty recently, and I came to the same conclusion, but people always bring up, hey, Dzeeff, doesn't this deck just lose to Dragoon? And that is true, so I decided to play these, but I think it was a wrong choice in hindsight. We also played 3 copies of Village. Strikers are not very popular anymore, but this card is just great in general. It stops the Duster, it stops the Lightning Storm, it stops Cosmic, it stops Twin. This card is great. You have to play 3 right now. And then the last 4 cards were for back row decks, Duster, and 3 copies of Evenly. Evenly's actually pretty good against Tri-Brigade. You get rid of their entire board, they probably keep the Revolt, but if they had any other back row cards, which a lot of times they do, now you don't have to deal with those. This deck can deal with 1 Revolt pretty easily, so I think evenly matched, putting them down to only having Revolt is a really good thing, especially if you happen to have Faker in hand, which I never did with the evenly matched, but it has come up in the past, and it's obviously a huge deal if you do have the Faker on the resolution of evenly. That is just a really good 2-card combo to have when going second. Anyway though, that is all for today's video. I hope you guys enjoyed it. This is my current Altergeist deck list. I got 3rd in the giant card event, so now I'll have a 3rd oversized Yu-Gi-Oh card to add to my collection. I hope to get them framed at some point, but for now they're just sitting back there. But anyway, I'll see you guys later. Thanks so much for watching. Goodbye.